Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stellar Open Protocol discussion. So for those of you who are watching, just a quick reminder, the goal of these meetings is to talk about and plan for changes to upcoming versions of the Stellar Protocol. And so we go over core advancement proposals, or CAPs. These are open source specs. They describe new features designed to evolve the protocol to meet ecosystem needs. So CAPs go through a rigorous process before they're actually implemented in Stellar Core and then put forward for a validator vote in a new protocol version. And so before the network upgrades, validators, they have to agree to accept that new version of the protocol that actually includes the implemented change. This meeting is just a part of that process, right? It's where people raise questions and dig into technical details and work together to think through proposals. And we're broadcasting it so that everyone out there can see the gears turning. But I also want to say there's a complementary asynchronous discussion on the Stellar Dev mailing list. And we encourage anyone who has thoughts about changes to the protocol to join that mailing list and participate in the discussion. There's a link to it in the event description. I'm going to talk about it more in a second. But first, I just want to say last meeting, we started talking about two similar proposals, CAP 37 and CAP 38, both of which suggest a method to introduce automated market makers at the protocol levels. So automated market makers, AMMs, they allow the creation of liquidity pools, which are simple and non-interactive, and which can attract large amounts of capital and enable high volumes of trading. So they're a simple way to provide the liquidity that's necessary for asset exchange, and that's the goal here, right? To implement a change to the Stellar protocol aimed at improving overall network liquidity. So today we're going to continue the discussion about AMMs that kicked off about a month ago on the Stellar Dev mailing list. This is a technical discussion, so if you want to follow along, I suggest reading the CAPs, both of them, and the recent developer mailing list threads about them, which are linked to in the event description. So one thing I just want to mention real quick is that this morning, Orbit Lens, who is the author of CAP 37 and who unfortunately can't be here today, I don't think. He did raise some issues about the ongoing AMM discussion in a blog post. And there's a lot there. I don't think anyone here has had a chance to fully process it quite yet, but I imagine that people will have thoughts. And what makes sense to me is to discuss the points he raises on that Stellar Dev Google group I mentioned earlier. That way we can sort of discuss things in a public forum that's set up for participation rather than trading blogs back and forth. The key point, we are currently discussing these ideas. We haven't settled on the best implementations for bringing AMMs to Stellar, and we'd really love to hear the concerns folks have on the mailing list where we're working together to find the design that serves users. So here's where we are right now. Okay, at the last meeting, we talked about a few things, mostly in the context of CAP 38. We talked about liquidity pool reserve requirements, the relationship between the DEX and AMMs, whether to allow pool parameters to be updated, and whether or not to support multiple pools for the same asset pair. Now, there are still open questions about all those things, right, and ongoing discussion, again, on that Stellar Dev mailing list. But today, we're actually going to focus on something a little different. It's another question that needs to be answered by any AMM design, basically asset authorization and revocation, how that fits into AMMs. So Siddharth, in the CAP 38 thread, you suggested two different models for handling authorization and revocation. And I'm just wondering if, to start us off, you can sort of walk through that, those two models briefly and kind of outline the pros and cons of each.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I'll go over two approaches for auth revocation and forcing a redeem of the pool shares back to the owner. So in the first approach, revoking authorization on either on an asset trust line will redeem all pool shares that asset trust line has a balance in. So this will require us to first make sure that asset trust lines cannot be deleted while they have a balance in a pool, and will make the data layer more complex with additional queries and indexes for the lookup, because we have to look up all the pool trust lines and pools. The good thing about this approach is that it works like auth revocation with offers. So no additional steps are required when an issuer is regulating a specific asset. The second approach is a little different. The way it works is that an issuer of an asset in a pool can revoke auth on the pool trust line instead of the asset trust line to redeem shares held by the pool trust line. So any issuer of any of the assets in a pool can do this. And then once that happens, the pool shares held by that pool trust line will be redeemed back to the owner. This approach will require the issuer to look up all pool trust lines that it wants to revoke auth from, which isn't that big of a deal. But the bigger issue we wanted to address is that the issuer will also need to be aware of the additional step during auth revocation. because now that not only do you have to revoke auth on the asset trust line, but you may need to revoke auth on the pool trust line. So John had an idea here to require the issuer to opt in to liquidity pools. So once using an authorization flag on the using an account flag. So once that happens, then the issuer should be aware of nuances related to liquidity pools. The nice thing about this approach is that it's simple to implement and doesn't require changes in the data layer. The current Cap 38 proposal takes the second approach, but we should obviously get some thoughts on this and see if that's what we want to finalize on.
One thing I'll tack on to what Siddharth said is an idea from Nicola that perhaps this opt-in behavior for liquidity pools should only apply to assets that are already authorization required. This was also discussed on the mailing list, but I think this is an interesting addition because, you know, if you're not auth required, then there's no concerns about revoking stuff anyway, really. And in that kind of a setting, I think the majority of the assets on the network are not authorization required. And so most things would just kind of transition seamlessly, which I think is a cool advantage. But I think there are some pros and cons to that. So.
I mean, is it worth just outlining the pros and cons to that?
I mean, I think the major con is that it's just more complicated. Like when you're trying to figure out what's gonna happen, basically, it's like, okay, I have to look at this flag, but I also have to pair it up against this other flag. And I think that's kind of the major thing. Like, oh, you know, I'm looking at some asset. Can I put it in a liquidity pool? It's not as obvious in that case. So I think that's probably the biggest drawback of that kind of an additional step. And I think Lee was trying to say something a second ago, so I'm going to let him jump in.
Yeah, sorry. I was muted. How would it work if the asset was not auth required, but then the issuer decided to enable auth required?
In terms
Like
of that,
in terms of the ability to participate in pools. So like when adding auth required, would the issuer need to also indicate that the asset can continue to be used in pools?
it's an open question that I hadn't even considered yet. So it's a good question. I think that's another aspect of the complexity of all of this here. Ideally, the way I would kind of like it to work is that you these things kind of work like what's it called? The same way that auth required works today, which is that, as I've said many times, the name is very kind of misleading, and it's really more like what's your default authorization state. And the liquidity pools thing could work the same kind of way, where it's like, what's the default authorization state for a newly created pool share trust line? And so then it could be like the default state is equal to the OR of, is this flag explicitly set, and the not of auth required.
Yeah, I think the reason I asked it is because I think like we're talking about adding that to make it less of a foot gun for people for issuers to not have to know about how liquidity pools work if they're already auth required. But then the flip side is that for an asset that's not auth required and the issuer doesn't know about liquidity pools, if they suddenly make it auth required, then they need to know about that flag. If they're already allowing liquidity pools to be used.
So do we have any assets that are auth immutable but not auth required? Because if so, it seems like it would be kind of unfortunate if you couldn't use those in AMMs.
No.
You see, nobody does that. Nobody says, I promise I'm not going to revoke this asset. I'm going to make it auth immutable. Because that seems like the primary point of auth immutable is to like promise that you're not going to suddenly turn on the auth required flag, right?
I mean, like we have to me, and I think I mentioned that on the mailing list, the degenerate case of this is actually the XLM, right? It's basically a auth not required, immutable. So I think in my mind, it has to work the same way, right? For XLM versus this, this type of assets, and those type of assets, I think we want to have them on the network. They are basically like the purest from a crypto asset point of view.
Tomer, it's my understanding that like the auth immutable flag in general is just like not highly used. Perhaps not really anybody is using it at all under any circumstances. What's kind of the actual status of that right now?
Yeah, that's correct. The auth immutable flag is almost not used at all. I think maybe one issuer, I need to look that up. But usually when issuers want to make a statement about the asset being locked down, they actually do the remove signature way to be something not achievable.
So actually, my comment would apply to that case too. If anybody sort of created non-auth required assets and nuked the signing weights on the issuing account, it would be a bummer if those assets couldn't work with the AMM. I feel like we probably wanted to, a default on thing, unless there are no such assets.
So the question is, do we expect such assets to exist? And Nico said something very smart, which is like, this is like the crypto asset in its purest form, right? But to some extent, it's somewhat of a myth. And if you look at, a lot of popular tokens in like the ERC20 universe, there is almost no such thing as an immutable asset anymore. Like all ERC20 contracts are actually proxies so that they can be upgraded if if you discover like malicious backdoors or whatever. So there's almost always some sort of oversight. It might be some consortia via multisig or something like that, but it's very rare to have almost non-existent to have like assets in it, like the pure untouchable form.
And so I guess the other sort of question about the current state of the ecosystem is, let's say that we kind of flip the polarity such that there's a flag that's off by default, but you could just, as an issuer, set it says like, don't use this in AMMs or something, right? Do we think that there are any people out there who they have an asset that they really care that it's not used in an AMM, but they sort of lack the competence or awareness to set such a flag if we give them like a month's notice or something?
I can't think of such assets.
Because I feel like I want this, of course we want the MM to be usable as widely as possible. And we also want to be in a position where we don't have people sort of bitterly complaining that we pulled the rug out from under them. But beyond that, so to me that suggests we want some kind of like default on thing, basically.
I mean, Tomer, from the perspective of what if the motivation for adding this kind of a flag in the first place, it kind of originated from this notion of what about people who wrote some code and have something running on their back end, and it's issuing assets and receiving requests to revoke them and whatever, and these guys they don't realize that something has changed out from underneath them, and people start putting stuff into liquidity pools, they revoke, but it doesn't actually really do the job because those assets are still in the liquidity pool, they're still being traded. Do you think anybody would even care? Because if nobody cares and nobody would really be in this situation, this isn't a problem it doesn't matter if this situation might arise a year in the future. If you show up a year in the future and you start doing something, well, I expect you to know what the current state of what you're doing is. It's only for people who already have operations. And if you don't think any of those people would care, then maybe we don't have to jump through any of these hoops at all.
So I think both this edge case and the edge case that kind of like David brought up are very edgy. They're just not I'm having a hard time thinking about anyone that will actually be affected by this in the ecosystem. I think that if we would have assets, a lot of assets like that in the ecosystem, then I would say that David's kind of like on by default would make sense, because they would probably want to participate in these liquidity pools. But then we'd have a problem with the mechanics of how to revoke change, and kind of like, and your point comes into play. In reality, I just don't think it matters all that much. I think what you suggest, John, is probably more complete, in that if anyone is relying on existing behavior, they don't get borked when they try to revoke like a new asset, liquidity pool stuff. Yeah, I just don't think it matters all that much. Like, I vote for what you said, John, for having an off by default, so that people know that there's like a special handling required.
For
I
auth
guess-
required, or not just auth, like in general, because I think that's kind of one of the distinctions we are trying to draw in the conversation, was for auth required assets, you do want it off by default, but the ones that are not auth required can be on by default. It's like you're authorized.
But wait,
It's
but
the
I
same-
thought we just
same
finished
thing
saying
than
that if we had it on by default, that like there's probably nobody who would mind.
Right. That's what I was confused about too. Like, Tomer, can you clarify actually? Like, are you saying that we should remove the flag because you don't think anybody would actually want the flag to be set? Or are you saying that we should do one of the things that either I was suggesting, David was suggesting, any of us were suggesting? I'm a little confused.
So I thought we were discussing a dedicated flag that is on by default, or sorry, off by default for auth required assets. Yeah, so I was supporting that.
So in other words, if you have an auth required asset, you have to designate it. You have to flip the flag to say this auth required asset can now be used in liquidity pools.
Yeah, that is indeed what I agreed with. Yeah.
The opt-in. Yeah.
And I think, David, that would cover your case too, because if you're auth required, you need to have at least, no, you could just have low signing weight only.
I guess it also depends. Yeah, can you set this flag with low signing weight? I mean, I guess I'd rather I'd rather stuff be on by default, right? For the same reason, like auth required isn't the default. I would like it if inhibit AMM weren't, or whatever, require AMM auth weren't on by default for anyone. It's very easy to convince ourselves that there's edge cases where like somebody's like not gonna be paying attention and it's gonna run into huge problems. But if these are edge cases, then I'd rather just have the functionality on by default. It also simplifies the logic, a tiny bit. And it gives more possibility. Like, who knows? Maybe there actually is some asset that you like really don't want to have used in an AMM for some reason, but you don't want to auth require it.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but if they do have auth required right now, then and we turn it on by default, then the authorization semantics as understood by the issuer essentially get like invalid or changed, right?
Oh, I see. So you're suggesting like a big database migration on the protocol upgrade, which actually is another thing. We can just kind of like it's an inhibit flag that's going to be auth by default, but for starters, everybody who's currently auth required, we actually set the flag when we introduce it. Is that what I wasn't thinking about that, but.
And in that situation, if someone showed up new to issue a new asset, it would be, and they decided to make it auth required, it would automatically be on. It would be
No, they'd have to decide. Like the same way auth required is off by default, the AMM inhibit flag is going to be off by default. And so when you set one, you might or might not want to set the other. These are like, it's part of your decision tree. It's the same as you have to decide whether you want to set auth immutable, which, most people don't, but, or like auth clawback or whatever. Like we're just going to have, when you want to issue an asset, like these are the decisions that you need to make about your asset. And so if we kind of, clearly document that you have to make like 3 different decisions about what your asset's going to behave like, then I feel fine going forward. And it's just a question of, do we have like existing assets where like people are like would not have the competence or awareness that they need to like change this flag if they care about it, and then like a month after we announce this and the thing goes live, then they would run into problems.
Can I flip this discussion over for a second now and say like, these problems don't really exist as much or really at all, if we did the other authorization model, the version 1 that Starth listed, which is basically like make it work exactly like offers work today. You get your auth revoked. Now your pool shares are all going to get revoked too. Obviously, this has some like implementation burden on our side. It would make us have more things to test and whatever. But if it's justified, then maybe we should consider that.
But that's not semantically equivalent. So the question is, I actually see these things as almost orthogonal. Like there's 2 different things. Like one is like what happens when like, particular people get sanctioned or whatever. And another question is, do you not want there to be do you want a tighter like control of like the market in your asset? And they seem like different questions, and I could imagine different asset issuers answering different ways for the 2 questions.
So John, with the V1 you described, does that mean does that mean issuers do not have the ability to opt out of liquidity pools?
We could still add that feature if we wanted to, but that feature would no longer be one of these kind of like you could make this work and everything would kind of look transparent from an issuer's perspective. Like different things would be happening on the network, but the same operations that they were doing to control accounts would all still work. So in the version 1 approach, I agree with David, the questions are orthogonal. Like, how do we want to control, you have this choice on how to control the auth, you make a certain choice, and then the other degree of freedom is totally open. But if you go the approach 2, then you're not in an orthogonal space anymore, because then you have this backwards compatibility problem that appears. But we could kind of answer the question separately. Like maybe we want the flag either way, so then it matters a bit less.
Yeah. So I'm reading Siddharth's outline here, and I'm leaning towards V1 in terms of like a more sensible contract that's in line with what we have today. I don't have, UCore folks need to, express how bad this is in terms of implementation, because I think from a contract perspective, this just, is more in line with what you have today.
It's like it's variably bad, I guess, is the best way to characterize it. In a world where we only have 2 asset liquidity pools, it's like probably not so bad. But like if we were in a world where we were like, oh, like balancer type pools with 8 assets are actually great, then it starts becoming kind of problematic. The reason it becomes kind of problematic is that we have to be able to efficiently extract all the pool shares that have to get revoked, but they might correspond to any of the assets in the pool. And let's say there's 8, just for the sake of argument. Maybe in pool 1, it's the 3rd asset, and then in pool 2, it's the 7th asset, and in pool 3, it's the 1st asset. So you end up breaking out all the assets into separate columns in your databases. You get an index on every column. Right now, an average table in our database has either 0 or 1 indices. So like, for example, if we were in this world, that would add, 8 times as many indices as I think the trust line table currently has. So that's kind of the perspective here. There's probably big performance complications as soon as you add 8 indices. Every index operation is basically a table operation. So,
I mean, to be fair, you don't necessarily need to do that many indexes. Like you can do it in a way that's a little more like, map asset to like it's a multi-map basically.
Like creating a separate table to query against?
Yeah, it's a separate table for indexing, purely for indexing. It's two lookups, but it might be a lot more efficient than
that might be more efficient, more complicated too, because then
it's one B tree, right, as opposed to many B trees.
Yeah. So I mean, like that could be a better implementation, but then we have to maintain an extra table. So yeah, it might be more efficient, probably more complicated.
Look, V1 makes more sense from a contract perspective. Is there someone that disagrees with that? Okay.
I agree.
Everyone agrees. Okay. So, in that case, Nico, you folks need to put your foot down on whether this is like acceptable or the complexity in core just makes it so that we need to make the less sensible contract decision.
Yeah, I agree.
Gears are
Okay.
turning.
Justin, maybe we need to let the core folks huddle up and figure out like how.
Yeah, I feel like that's true. Are there any other questions about this topic that we want to make sure to cover, or is that our stopping point? The core folks go back and think about whether the more sensible contract approach V1, whether the implementation is a showstopper, blocker, or is there more? Is there more?
I guess the only question I'll still ask here is like, do we still want the flag? Because like we could always add the flag later if people want to opt out, and that would just mean that we have less work to do and we can deliver this sooner.
I can reach out to some issuers and see if that's a showstopper in any way. Intuitively, I can't think of any issuer that would passionately want to disable their asset from participating in liquidity pools, but I'm not sure.
Is there, like, to the extent I would imagine people doing that, I could imagine a situation where what you really want is like, you believe that there's sort of like 2 or 3 high quality assets that are KYC'd and whatever, and so you're willing to have your asset have a market against those, and you don't want just like random people buying your asset where you can't sort of trace one hop and ask who that was. So is there any possibility to give issuers control over what assets they're allowed to be matched with, like to have a trust line on the liquidity pool itself as opposed to an individual participant?
That's an interesting concept. My kind of a priori intuition on this is that you can't control that today anyway, because you could already do it against the DEX, like the existing order book. And if that's the kind of feature you wanted, you're probably using the cap 18 semantics, which is, for people listening, it's like this like fine-grained authorization control, and it's mapped up against some SEP, which number I can't remember right now. So I can't really see how adding this feature at the protocol level would. You're muted, David. You're still muted. None of us can hear you, David.
Sorry, there could be like, a trade-off required flag or something that basically it applies to both AMMs and the DEX, and it says like I actually have to authorize any other asset that my asset is traded against.
So making it apply even to the existing order book.
Yeah. I mean, if nobody's asking for this, then, it's probably not worth doing, but this actually seems more useful than just like blanket inhibiting AMMs.
It's definitely an interesting idea, not one that I've heard before. I think Tomer can find out what people really want, and that's probably a good starting point. But if you're going to do that and it's retroactive onto the existing order book, I'd say let's do it as a separate kind of proposal in a separate protocol version, probably just for the sake of expedience.
But then if we think that actually solves people's problems better than the existing ones, then maybe we don't need to worry as much about the existing ones, unless there's anybody saying like, don't let my asset be traded in AMMs.
But do let it be traded on the DEX, like someone.
Yeah, which is weird. Like,
it's hard for me to imagine what that use case is, but maybe it's there. I don't know.
Yeah, I think given that, we don't have this feature around the DEX right now, and, we haven't had issuers saying, I'm not going to issue this asset because I'm afraid it's going to be traded on the DEX. I think we're probably in the same boat with liquidity pools.
Okay, maybe let's call it a day.
Well, I mean, in fairness, there's probably people who say like, I'm just not going to issue my asset on a blockchain because I'm scared of blockchains. And so this would be more like we could come to people and say, hey, you've heard of these two issuers who are like, reputable in the non-blockchain financial world. Well, guess what? Like you could make your asset available only for like, only for sale for like customers of like these two banks or whatever. And that would it would be a way of kind of attracting people who are otherwise afraid of blockchain by making it less unknown. But again, this would be, I guess, a separate proposal. So.
Right, so back to this issue for this particular proposal. It seems like where we've ended, at least with today's discussion, is V1 makes more sense as a contract. But the question is, what does the implementation look like? And that's something that the core team will think about. Seems true, right? Seems like where we've ended up. Okay.
I have a question about author revocation. It's not really to do with V1 versus V2. I think it applies to both of them. And it's from Siddharth's email where he presented these two different options. It says in the email that if the pool shares can't be sent back to the owner, that is impossible, that they're going to get stored in a claimable balance for the owner. Is that something we're still considering? And if so, I'm just a little concerned. That seems like that would be very unpredictable, and applications, like they may not really handle that edge case. So yeah, I'm just curious about that.
So we're still thinking about how that case would work, regards to claimable balances, and we initially considered always putting it into a claimable balance, but there are still questions around like how reserves would work here and things like that. So it's still open. We're still thinking about it.
If you have an idea to how to avoid this problem, I'd be like super enthusiastic about it. I've had, I think, 3 calls with Siddharth where we've tried to think about how you could avoid doing this. And we always run into some case which pretty much forces you to create a claimable balance as it stands today. But maybe there's some other thing we can constrain that we haven't figured out yet. I'm super, super open to ideas here.
Lee, does that answer your question more or less?
Yeah, I think I would like to understand what all the cases are where a claimable balance would be required. I assume I can maybe think of one, but I'm not really sure if I totally understand the problem it's solving.
So some examples of some cases where you would require them, just off the top of my head, it's probably not going to be complete. But one case is you're in a pool share and you're in a liquidity pool and you've removed the trust lines for the corresponding assets. So for example, it's like I'm in a USDA, USDB pool, but I don't have the trust line for USDB anymore because all my USDB is in the pool. there's no way to return the money to you other than creating a claimable balance. Another case would be if your USDB trust line still existed, but because the pool has moved in your favor, which is kind of unlikely for these particular assets, but whatever, imagine, then you no longer have sufficient limit to receive the additional amount of USDB that you would have gotten. There are all kind of variations on this problem. Or it's like, oh, I also have some order book offers, and therefore I have liabilities, and then that causes me to have insufficient available limit to receive the balance, stuff like that.
Okay, thanks. I'll have a think about it as well.
There's also a bit of discussion about this on the mailing list. It's like quite a few posts from the bottom now, but Nicola was having, one of the things Nicola was chewing on was this notion of capping off the available balance, like the available supply of an asset, because right now it's actually possible for an asset's like total supply to exceed in64 max, which is interesting. I went and looked, and there were like 30 assets, all with funny names, or largely with funny names, that have this condition. And so I don't think anybody serious has this problem. And if we avoided this situation, it might make a lot of other things simpler, and it might avoid some cases with liabilities and stuff. But like, it's definitely not like an obvious win. There are still some other things that can happen. We probably need additional cases, additional constraints in addition to that. But you can read more about that on the mailing list, because I don't even remember what was in that post entirely.
Great. Any other questions or topics that we want to go over today, or should we just sort of mull over what we've discussed so far and bring it back to the Stellar Dev mailing list? Cool deal. So yeah, everyone watching, thank you for joining us for this protocol discussion. Again, the thing that we keep talking about, the Stellar Dev mailing list, there's a link in the event description, and it really is the place where we start to hash this out, right? Like, all of these discussions are happening there. There are discussions about both CAP 37 and CAP 38, and we definitely want to hear from people as we start to think through these designs in order to come up with solutions that really meet the needs of the ecosystem. So really appreciate it. Please join the discussion. Thanks everyone who joined here on this panel, and I'll see you next time.